In this video, I'd like to share with you in the state of Texas how to find the Health and Safety Code, Chapter 711. I refer to it a lot of my instructional videos, and it's really simple. You don't have to remember a whole bunch of things. You can do this. You can type 711.003, hit return, and you're going to come up with the Health and Safety Code. Health and Safety Code, Chapter 711 in general. This is going to cover the majority of your cemetery management questions. It will start off with definitions at the very front of the chapter. We're going to come down to 003, records of interment. 711.003 talks about the records that shall be kept of each interment in a cemetery. The record must include the date the remains are received, the date the remains are interred or placed in the ground, or a mausoleum or a niche, the name and age of the person interred, if those facts can be conveniently obtained, and the identity of the plot in which the remains are interred. 4 things. That's it. That's all you have to do in your record keeping, is you have to keep these 4 things. And the identity of the plot in which the remains are interred. That's very important. In our older cemeteries, they are not mapped out, platted out, like a modern perpetual care municipal cemetery is. We have family lots where we say, well, this is the family space over here, and over here next to Grandpa looks like a good space. Unfortunately, sometimes they go to open up a new grave space and they find that that's already been used. It's an unmarked grave. Sometimes we are multiple generations removed from the first burial, and that's the case we have in the Jones Cemetery. So this is going to talk about how we're going to recreate those records that don't exist. So this is what the research looks like for the folder of the Hispanic section. We've gone through Find a Grave, and we've started downloading each and every page that family members or other genealogists might have been posting for a burial. In some cases, and we're still early on in doing this section, we have a death certificate. So here, for example, is a death certificate from November the 26th of 1959 of a young child who died in a house fire. But what's important is you look up here, and it says burial, and it says Jones Cemetery. This is how we validate who is buried at the cemetery. That's not to say somebody might have been exhumed and moved to another cemetery at a later date. We have a couple that were originally buried in other cemeteries and have been exhumed and brought to the Jones Cemetery. So as you can see, there's lots of work that goes on here. Occasionally we'll find a photo of somebody. We think it's very important that we have photos. If you've got photos of your family members, let's include them in the history of the site. So you can see that there's a lot of work that goes into this. The Excel spreadsheet looks something like this. This is a list of everybody that we know of to date, and we know that there are going to be spelling errors. But the list is set up by last name, first and middle or maiden name, a birth date, a death date in its full format, and then I've taken the death date and broken it down into month, day, and year. Is it available on the AGS website, which was done, I think, in 2012 when somebody went through and inventoried these? This is BG is another list that is found at the History Center. Barbara Goudreau, she and her husband collected a list of names found in cemeteries. This was done in the 1990s. But again, nobody knows if the sites were totally clean when this happened, and the information may not be 100%. And then we have Find a Grave, whether we have a listing on Find a Grave, and if we have a death certificate. And again, we've just started searching through these. Death certificates are available from about 1913 or so up to 1976. If there's one in Travis County, chances are we can pull it up and then save it into the database. What's important here is this list not only gives me an alphabetical sense, but I can sort this list. I can come up here and highlight the whole box. I can sort it. I can do a custom sort, and I want to sort by the year they died, the month they died, and the day they died. So when I do this, my whole list magically changes on me. And again, some of these lists, there are graves markers that do not have any information on them. They may be curbed in or the marker is gone. Sorting this out, here we find Gabriella from 1900. Then it's 1907, and it's 1911, 1912, 1913. This allows me to look at the site and see, as far as we know, who was buried in what year. This lets me know that to date, we know that sometime in 1900 or in 1907, the Hispanic section started being used. We don't have enough information for the African American section yet. It could be that some of these unknowns are some of the first burials predating 1900, because remember the deed said from 1934 it had been used for over 40 years. So we know that there are going to be unknown burials in here. That's why we need to get information from family members who may have heard from their grandparents or have something in a family Bible that discusses who's buried where. If we take a look at the work to date, we have for the Jones, the Anglo side of the cemetery. Again, this is where we started off. All these ones marked PDF, for the most part, are the Find a Grave listings. And then we have large family sections over here. Unlike the Hispanic section, the Anglo section appears to be sold off into larger family lots. That's not to say that they don't have family lots at the Hispanic section, but the Anglo section is very much divided into family lots. So once we did all this, then we found all of the Joneses and the Davises and the LaFrances. Now the Joneses married into the LaFrances, into the Leatherwoods, into the Meredith family. These all would have been neighbors of David Jones. So as he had children, then he started, his daughter started marrying into these other families. His sons married into the other families as well. And so this is the kind of work, you can see all the death certificates we found. The older areas, we won't find anything. And again, there's a picture of Dr. Joel T. Griffith, who is at rest out here. This is an interesting photo. This little girl here is named Wanda Faye Wiley. She was the poster child for March of Dimes in 1950. She's at rest there at the cemetery, as is her sisters and brothers. So there's a lot of interesting history at this site. Some of the other things we're doing is looking at the Jones family and looking at family trees. And you can see that here's David Jones. He's the guy that bought the land. If it's in green, they're buried at the cemetery. If it's in yellow, they're buried someplace else. So here's David. His first wife is there. His first wife's parents are there, the Gilberts, and her sister is there. And then they had children. They had William Yancey Jones. He married this woman. They had children. And then there were other descendants. So you can see that part of this is we have to try to piece these families together to try to figure out who's related to who. That's the fun part of it. When we look at the burial list that we've created for the Anglo side, you can see that the last names are Allen here. And again, it's the same format: last name, first name, middle, and maiden. Birth dates, death dates, and then sorting by month, year, and day. There was a listing in 1965 done by Banks McLaurin that I found. And so I was able to include all of his listings. The Barbara Godot list in 1994. The Austin Genealogy Society list in 2012. Find a Grave listing from 2017. And then is there a death certificate? And again, If we were to sort this by year, this is what we come up with. So this is the burial list for the Anglo section at the Jones Cemetery. You can see that I've been able to manipulate the list in Excel and sort it first by year of death, then by month, and then by day. This is a very good tool because now I can see chronologically. And again, these lists are comprised of visible features such as headstones or listings from previous researchers who have published their work and made them available in online or at archives such as the Austin History Center or other places. So this gives me a chronological list of the ones we know. We know there are going to be many that are not listed and that are just going to be unknown of who's buried in this cemetery. And so you can see that it starts in the 1800s to the 1900s. And if you wanted to, you could chart this out and actually see what the most popular year was. And then in some cases, if a cemetery is stopped being used, then you know that it's basically full or everyone's forgotten about it. Our best guess is Alberto Meredith. He was known as the Bike Man. I found some interesting stuff on him. He was laid to rest in November the 3rd of 2015. We do know that the woman that I showed you a picture of, who was the March of Dimes, her sister just passed away. Family chose cremation, and they'll be bringing the remains out probably sometime in February or March and interring those remains there. So we have to work with the families to put all of this information together. Why is this important? Well, having a list of burials and having a map tells us that in future generations, if somebody wants to come in and says, hey, wait a minute, there's a spot here, I need to put Uncle Eddie in. Or if the other family members have said, wait a minute, based on what Grandma told me, there's a baby buried right there, then we don't disturb that gravesite. And so being able to tell what's available in your inventory is very important, and not disturbing unknown burials is, of course, very important. This is the information we have to date on the African American section. It is completely overgrown. It's going to take a lot of work to go in there and clean by hand very carefully, remove the trash, the debris, the overgrowth, and then start examining this, and I'm sure we're going to add more names to this list. What we know to date. This is the list that's sorted by year. We have a headstone from 1911. And again, the Hispanics, the earliest one we have is from 1900. So it appears that right after the turn of the century is when this thing really started being used by others. It's very possible that in the 1890s that African Americans who were sharecroppers or other folks in this community and that couldn't be buried in the Manor Cemetery because of their race chose this area. But the chances of them having a durable headstone that survived is very slim. In this cemetery, we have 25 burials that we're aware of. And those are based on, we found a headstone, you know, the Barbara Goudot list in 1994, they didn't survey this. The Banks list didn't survey the African American section. But Find a Grave does have some in there. And a lot of times people are posting on Find a Grave not because they found a headstone, it's because they were doing research and ran into a death certificate. You see this column here where we have death certificates that stated that these people were buried out there. So they created the Find a Grave page for that person, but we don't have a stone. A lot of work still needs to happen over here, and a lot of that will happen in February during Black History Month. Most importantly, because it's still cool in Texas in February. You wait till spring or summertime, and it will be ungodly hot, and the red bugs, the chiggers will be out. They attack you at your ankles. They're worse than mosquitoes. So this is going to be a long-term project. Let's take a look at some of the information we found so far. Okay, here's the folder for the African American section, and you can see these here are all death certificates that we've been able to pull up online. Here is Alexander Canada Jr. And he passed away in 1951. This is a name that I've seen in other African American cemeteries, but it clearly states that he's at Jones Hill Cemetery. Jeff Canada, again, another Canada, and nephritis. And so what's interesting about reading these, and again, Jones Cemetery down here. What's interesting about reading these is you really get a feeling for what the mortality rate was back then and what people were dying of. Things that are things we can commonly address today, but a lot of this was diet, and in this case, a lot of it has to do with genetics, hypertension. Here's one, pulmonary tuberculosis, very common against the whites, the Hispanics, and even the Anglos. Many of them died from TB. We've all but eliminated TB, but again, Jones Cemetery. This may be the only listing of this gentleman or this person's existence, and probably the only history of her existence is this one piece of paper, a death certificate. Chances are we may be able to find descendants who can generate a photo. And then we archive that at the Austin History Center, and we're able to, piece by piece, start creating the history of not only this family, but of this community.